What's going on, everybody? Kalipa's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a comparison between the Visible Midnight and the Motorola Moto G Power 2022. Now, before we go any further, I do want to remind you to go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about either of these phones, be sure to check out their full reviews and tips and tricks videos on the channel. But with all that being said, let's get started. So the Visible Midnight has a 6.52-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. We got a water drop notch up here for the front-facing camera, and this camera is 8 megapixels. Overall, as far as the design goes, this is very much an entry-level phone. It has the same kind of look as pretty much all the phones in this price range do, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but at the same time, it's not really unique in any way. The display itself is decently large, which is going to give you a good experience with content consumption. So whether you're streaming videos, viewing photos, playing a game, it's all going to look decently large and pretty nice on this phone. The quality of the image isn't bad. It could definitely be better, but considering that it's only 720p, it's really pretty acceptable. Now, one thing I'm not a huge fan of about this display is the viewing angles. I think it's pretty bad because if you're outside, like in sunlight or something like that, or just viewing your phone at a different angle besides just straight on, you're not going to be able to see anything very well at all. But if you're just inside casually watching a video or something like that, it's going to be pretty decent. Another nice thing about this phone is that it has a pretty tall and narrow form factor. So when you're reading, you can fit more on the screen without having to scroll as much. And when you're watching a video in landscape mode, it's going to have a nice cinematic look. Now, the Motorola Moto G Power 2022 has a 6.5-inch IPS LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 270, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So for the most part, these displays are pretty similar, but with an IPS LCD display, the Motorola Moto G Power 2022 is going to be a little bit better quality. I do have the brightness at 100% for both these phones, and as you can see, the Moto G Power 2022 is quite a bit brighter, and I think the image looks a lot better. It looks a little bit sharper as opposed to this. The viewing angles on the Moto G Power 2022 are a little bit better. It's still not the greatest, but if you're in direct sunlight outside or something like that, it's going to be a little bit easier to see than it will be on the Visible Midnight. Now, another interesting thing about the Moto G Power 2022 is that it has a 90 Hz refresh rate, which means the movement on the screen is going to be a little bit faster and smoother. You probably can't really tell from this, but basically if you're consuming content like watching a video or something like that, you're definitely going to notice at least a little bit of a difference. In comparison, the Visible Midnight only has a 60 Hz display, but again, it doesn't make a huge difference right away. You're really only going to be able to tell if you're consuming a lot of content, but all the same, it still does make at least some difference. Now with the Moto G Power 2022, we're getting a hole punch up here for the front-facing camera, and this camera is also 8 megapixels. I will say I do like the appearance of the Moto G Power quite a bit better than that of the Visible Midnight. It looks a lot nicer, more modern, a little bit more unique, and the hole punch camera really helps with this. But on the other hand, the Visible Midnight definitely has a lot more weight to it, and the materials and build quality in general do feel a little bit better. The backs of these phones both have matte finishes. Neither of them really show fingerprints very badly, but I do think it looks a little bit better with the Moto G Power. I do like this wavy texture a little bit more than the Visible Midnight's texture that's more standard and basic. Now for storage, the Visible Midnight is getting 32 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and the Moto G Power 2022 is getting 64 gigabytes of internal storage, also with microSD card expansion. So the Moto G Power definitely has a big advantage here with double the storage. 32 gigabytes really isn't a whole lot of space. Even the average user is probably going to go through that pretty quickly. Now with both of these phones, I do recommend getting a microSD card, because having extra storage and a place to offload photos and videos is never a bad thing. But if you're more of a power user, you're probably going to be able to get away with the 64 gigabytes in the Moto G Power 2022, whereas with the 32 gigabytes you get with the Visible Midnight, you're going to run out of space real fast, and that's going to be a huge drawback for you. Now, if you're a really conservative user and you don't do a whole lot with your phone, either of these phones will be fine, but in this day and age, with the system, apps, data, all of that getting larger and larger, having extra storage is getting to be more and more of an important thing. To give you an idea of what all this looks like with the Visible Midnight, I'm using 14.98 gigabytes right now, taking up 47% of the storage. And this is mostly just the system. I have a few apps, of course, but they're really nothing crazy. No games or anything like that. Whereas with the Moto G Power 2022, I'm using 21.63 gigabytes, taking up 34% of the storage. With this phone, again, most of it is the system, but I also have some larger apps on this phone, taking up 7 gigabytes. And as you can see, percent-wise, there's still more space available on the Moto G Power 2022, despite using a lot more space than on the Visible Midnight. That really just goes to show storage does make a huge difference, and in this area, the Moto G Power 2022 definitely has a huge advantage. Now, one unique feature about the Visible Midnight is that it does have wireless charging. In fact, it supports 10-watt wireless charging, whereas the Moto G Power 2022 does not have wireless charging. Now, that's not really a game changer by any means. I wouldn't base a decision specifically off that feature, but it is worth pointing out, and it is a nice, unique advantage the Visible Midnight has over not only the Moto G Power 2022, but the vast majority of phones in this general price range as well. Now, for security features, both these phones have a fingerprint scanner. With the Visible Midnight, it's right here on the power key, and with the Moto G Power 2022, it's right here on the rear, and they both have Face Unlock. So as far as security goes, both these phones have all the options. It really just comes down to which placement you like better for the fingerprint scanner. I know a lot of people prefer it on the power key, and I guess objectively that's a little bit better, but both of them are really fast. So let me demonstrate each fingerprint scanner so you can see how well they work. So starting with the Visible Midnight. There we go, one more time. And there we go. As you can see, it's real fast and responsive. No issues here. Moving on to the Moto G Power 2022. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, this one is real fast and responsive as well. So performance-wise, I would say these fingerprint scanners are pretty much equal. There's some phones out there with slightly less responsive fingerprint scanners, but neither of these phones fall in that category. And again, they both have Face Unlock, so I don't really think either of them has an advantage over the other. Now, taking a look at the rear camera setup of the Visible Midnight, we got a triple camera here with a 13 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode. With the Moto G Power 2022, we also got a triple camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So for what they are in their respective specific price ranges, both of these phones do take some real nice photos. Technically, the Moto G Power 2022 is a slight step up from the Visible Midnight, but really not by much. But with that being said, with a 50 megapixel main camera, you're going to be able to get much better photos than you will with the Visible Midnight. But with that being said, both of them do take really good photos for both their main cameras and portrait mode. So if you just want to use those features, both of them are great options for that, with the Moto G Power 2022 being the slightly better one. Now, as far as the other features go, I do think the Visible Midnight has a little bit of an advantage with the ultra-wide camera versus the Moto G Power's macro camera, because I think an ultra-wide camera is a lot more useful than a macro camera. And it is a little disappointing because the Moto G Power 2020 actually did have an ultra-wide camera. They took the feature away in 2021 and it obviously hasn't since come back. So that is a little too bad. But as far as the features go, obviously if you prefer a macro camera, the Moto G Power 2022 is going to have an advantage. But if you'd rather have an ultra-wide camera, the Visible Midnight is of course going to have an advantage there. For video, neither of these phones are really anything special. They can both shoot video in up to 1080p in both the rear and front cameras. Nothing really extraordinary. I wouldn't use either of these phones for serious videos, whether it's B-roll or stuff that actually includes audio. It doesn't matter, you can do a lot better than these phones, but for casual stuff like Snapchat, it should be okay. Now internally, the Visible Midnight is getting 3 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio P22 processor. The Moto G Power 2022 is getting 4 gigabytes of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G37 processor. I ran Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of these phones, and the Visible Midnight came back with a single core score of 147 and a multi-core score of 820. The Moto G Power 2022 came back with a single core score of 183 and a multi-core score of 1027. So neither of them are exceptionally powerful. For what they are, they're both pretty entry-level phones. They're gonna get the job done for basic activities like sending text messages, making calls, browsing the web, and maybe some light social media use, and then streaming videos and basic mobile gaming. Both should be fine with that kind of thing, but the Moto G Power 2022 is definitely gonna have an advantage here because it is, both in these scores and in practice, significantly faster. Now, as far as performance issues and stuff like that, I haven't had anything too bad with either of these phones, but the Moto G Power 2022 has run perfectly smoothly with everything, whereas with the Visible Midnight, although it has been running decently smoothly for most of the time, there have been several occasions where I've had apps crash. Now, I wouldn't expect it to happen all the time, but if you're on your phone constantly, I would say the Moto G Power 2022 is going to have an advantage because during the time I've been using it, I haven't had a single app crash or anything like that, whereas it has happened once or twice with the Visible Midnight. For the battery, the Visible Midnight is getting a 4,000 mAh battery, and the Moto G Power 2022 is getting a 5,000 mAh battery. Now, neither of these batteries are bad. In fact, both of them are pretty good, but we're talking slightly above average with the Visible Midnight versus pretty much the biggest you can get with the Moto G Power 2022. So there's definitely no question here. If your number one concern is battery life, the Moto G Power is definitely going to come out on top. It's going to get more life throughout the day, and down the road as the battery starts to degrade, it's not going to affect you nearly as soon as it will with the Visible Midnight. So in conclusion, which of these phones is better? I would say overall, in most categories, the Moto G Power 2022 is the better device. It has a much nicer looking display, a better looking design, double the storage, a slightly better quality camera, a slightly more powerful processor, and a much more powerful battery. Now, with that being said, on the other hand, the Visible Midnight does have a nicer build quality in my opinion. The materials and the weight make it feel a little bit more premium. It also has wireless charging, which the Moto G Power doesn't, and it has an ultra-wide camera as well. But overall, again, if I were to choose between the two, I would say the Moto G Power 2022 is going to have most of the advantages. Now, as to whether or not you should get one over the other in real life, of course, the deals and promotions and stuff are always changing, and if you can get one of them for free, then I would say maybe go for that one. But if both of them are being considered at full price, then it becomes more of a question because typically the Moto G Power 2022 is going to be a little bit more expensive, so it really comes down to what's worth it to you. But I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, and as always, I will see you in the next video.